بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين الصلاة والسلام على سيدنا المرسلين وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Dear brothers and sisters, it gives me great pleasure to meet you again this Ramadan. I pray Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala makes it fruitful for us all. Ameen. Today's talk is really about finding our balance in Ramadan and looking at this from a holistic point of view. So there are many narrations around the concept of balance. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala firstly mentions that we are ummatan wasata, the middle path nation, and that he also, the Prophet has taught us that inna dina yusr wa lan yushad dina illa ghalaba. Verily, the religion is easy and nobody makes it difficult or overbearing except it overcomes him. And we have the hadith of when the young companions will agree that one of them wasn't going to eat, one of them wasn't going to marry, and the other one wasn't going to sleep. And the Prophet was very unhappy with this. And of course, this is not to do with Ramadan, but it's to do with the overall concept of mercy in our religion and ease that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created and balance. I want to talk about this concept of balance and what happens when we're out of balance and how that might be manifesting in our lives and what we can do about that this Ramadan. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has prescribed fasting for us so that we may attain taqwa. Taqwa is a state of obedience to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's commands and refraining from his prohibitions. And ultimately, it refocuses us on the hereafter and takes us away from ghafla and actually brings that spiritual balance back into our lives. But the other thing that I wanted to talk about was how we're actually living our lives and how we might be upsetting our own sort of spiritual and physical and emotional balance. So many of us women are living like ninja foodies. So I don't know if you've seen those fantastic electric pressure cookers that do everything under the sun. They can multitask and do about 15 different operations. And we're no different as women. We are cooking, cleaning, looking after our husbands, caring for our children. We're actually, many of us are mummages. We're PAs to our children, managing their schooling, their tutors, their play dates, their, sleepovers, their homework, their exams, their tarbiyah, everything. And then on top of that, we're going to work, we're keeping up to date, and then we're trying to be healthy. We're trying to do it all, and we're trying to have it all. And one of the greatest pieces of advice I was once given by a sister was that actually we want it all, but we can't actually have it all. And it's no surprise that women today are unhappier than they've ever been. I want to talk about the consequences of this doing too much. So when we're doing too much, we're actually putting our bodies under stress and strain. So, when we're doing that, stress can come from doing too much of a good thing. It doesn't have to be bad things. In fact, a certain amount of acute stress is very good for us. It upregulates the immune system and it increases our productivity. And without a bit of stress, we would actually die. So the hormone that wakes us up in the morning called cortisol is actually a stress hormone. However, where we have chronic and sustained stress, it can lead to various types of problems. So we'll talk about the physical first, and this is something that perhaps a lot of people are familiar with. So chronic sustained stress can lead to either what we call a high positive state, which is where you're getting everything done, but you're still angry and very snappy. And eventually what will happen is that you will snap. You will get, some form of inflammatory condition such as heart disease. On the corollary, sometimes, you can become completely burnt out, like a burnt out cigarette stub. So you've kind of lost your spark, you're completely exhausted and washed away. And eventually, if you stay in that state where you're so run down because you've been under stress for a long time, you can end up with cellular and autoimmune conditions. By autoimmune conditions, that would be things like cancer. Well, cancer isn't autoimmune, but it would include cancers, and also things like perhaps rheumatoid arthritis, thyroid conditions, inflammatory bowel is an inflammatory condition, but you would end up with a series of, autoimmune conditions and cancers. So it's being aware of the impact of chronic stress on our physical health. And our body will give us clues way before that, when we start to get sick frequently, or get run down, or get symptoms that we can't fully explain. It's when the body is talking to us, and that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's rahmah, it's a warning sign. The other impact is on mental health. And we know that we have, women are unhappier than ever before, despite all the opportunities in this so-called women's world, where, the XY chromosome is almost seen as redundant, and the schooling system favors women, and we're supposed to have all the opportunities to work, to own property, to be able to look after ourselves, to travel freely, and I'm talking non-Muslim paradigm, even have children without having a man. We are supposedly, it's a woman's world, but actually we're incredibly unhappy. And we may say that's down to women's temperament, we're just more predisposed, which may be true, that we're hormonal, we're sensitive. However, it doesn't explain the figures. And what we know is that a lot of women are experiencing burnout and anxiety and depression as a result. And the third point I wanted to raise was around intimacy. So intimacy is actually more complicated than just reproduction. It is the whole concept of carrying that female energy, and carrying that lover archetype. And to be able to have that, you've got to be able to slow down and find that energy. And if you're exhausted, we know that women's libido is affected by many, many things, not just the menstrual cycles, but also things like travel, things like exhaustion, things like energy. Very many things can actually knock off a woman's ability to actually feel sexually inclined. But actually, this is so important within the household, having that's partly the bedrock within the marriage, is being able to express your love towards your spouse. And if you're so washed out because you're just doing too much, it leads to conflict. And we know that 42% of marriages end in divorce. So it's really, really important that we're able to slow down and find that time for self-care, and fill our own cup so that we're able to fill the cups of others. And last, and actually perhaps the most important consequence, is the impact on our spiritual health. And even though we may not be wasting our time on frivolous things, we're busy, we're doing the halal, we're trying to serve Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala through looking after our families and going to work. The truth is that all of this preoccupation with dunya affairs, even with the right intention, can take us, place a strain on our spirituality, fill our hearts with ghafla, make us preoccupied with the dunya, and actually squeeze out any time or space to being spiritually connected. And that in itself is to our detriment. I also wanted to touch on the concept of menstruation while we're talking about women and women's needs and women's cycles and our hormones and our moods. And last year I spoke a little bit about the impact of fasting on our cycles, and how if you fast for more than 15 days, in rat studies, they showed that the ovaries start to shrink and it impacts the period. So actually, when we are having a break during the month, this is a mercy from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it's not a punishment. And, I was looking at the meaning of the word adhan, which is the word used to explain menses in the Quran. And amongst the various translations, it came up with a hurt, a pollution, an illness, a sickness. So there were a number of words used to describe the state. It's a state where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is actually telling us, he's teaching us self-care. He's telling us this is a time when you're weak and you're tired, and actually your husband shouldn't bother you. And actually, I'm going to lift the obligation of fasting from you so that you're able to give your body its rights. Many a time we treat our bodies as if they are machines. We own them and we treat them like slaves. We don't take the time to service them and MOT them and treat them with love and say thank you to them. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us our limbs on trust, and it's the one body we have to serve him and to meet our needs in the dunya. and we're not very good at looking after what he's given us. But he's telling us actually right now, slow down and take a rest. And that's from his mercy as well. So we need to acknowledge our cyclical nature and think about how we plan things and how we, what do we do around that time? Do we keep functioning like men, ploughing on and not respecting our needs? And in Ramadan, it's very easy for the same thing to happen. Either women feel upset that they can't fast, or that they fill themselves up with lots of other actions looking after other people, whereas actually your body might just be needing a rest. And doing some of those things and relieving the burden on other women may be a very rewardable action if it's within your power, but it may also be equally productive just to use that time of emotional lability and weakness to really implore Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sincerely and make some proper du'as, because you have that extra time, and to read and reflect and actually rest, so that when you start fasting again, you have the physical energy to be able to do that. So I want to now reframe this in the context of Ramadan. And I want to talk about how we sometimes go from one madness to the next. So we've already talked about the madness in our everyday lives, and how if we don't slow down, we squeeze out the space in our hearts to receive the light of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and how ideally we should start to prepare for Ramadan a few months beforehand, so that we can start to do clear out some of the space in our hearts, and to focus our attention on this special month. But on top of that, I want to talk about how we can sometimes go from a crazy life outside of Ramadan to a crazy timetable within Ramadan, which might include either managing all your children's activities or running things along the same sort of pattern and just doing Ramadan on top, or basically running a complex program of worship and socializing, whether it's Tarawih, Iftar, buying Eid gifts, whatever that might be. And then we wonder why we're so exhausted and we're not able to spiritually connect despite the month. And I wanted here to therefore raise the concept of balance. So often we think of going into Ramadan and having actually this month devoted to ibadah, and particularly ritual ibadah, but actually many of us are struggling with just finding the time to remember Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, just allowing that light to enter our hearts by clearing out the space in our hearts and our lives. And actually, it may just be a case of learning how to relive our lives, so that when we come out of Ramadan, we're able to live our lives differently, inshallah, to reevaluate and not live such a hectic, crazy pattern where our lives are passing us by and we haven't got time to really even worship properly, or we're worshiping but we can't really reflect and absorb and make those changes. And so I want to really talk about having a more relaxed Ramadan. And by this, I don't mean I don't mean kind of being lazy. I don't mean not valuing the time. I don't mean not worshipping, but I mean actually being really structured and organized and creating a proper time for rest, so that you're not burnt out and that light of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can enter our hearts. So before we can start the healing process and reach those spiritual heights, actually we need to allow ourselves to recover, and we need to actually just slow down to be able to start again. And the beautiful thing is that our religion is so easy, and that it's kind, and it depicts Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's mercy at every level. So I'm going to run through some tips for this, and I think I've got 5 tips. The first one is really, as I've said, we need to let go of some of our busyness to be able to find Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And finding Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala might not be on a prayer mat, it might not be in the Tarawih, it might not be in the way that we anticipate it to be. It may be that just by removing some of that business, we create time to stop doing and time to start thinking and reflecting, to be able to go on that walk, to feel the breeze, to see the leaves, to see hear the birds, and remember that they're all praising Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And something as simple as that might allow us to reconnect with our Lord. So I think it's really, really important to tackle the stress. So that's point number 1, tackle the stress and slow down. By slowing down, we can become more mindful in general of our actions, our behavior, but ultimately of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And we can embody good character. We don't snap when people say something. We're able to slow down, hear and think before we respond. And good character will weigh very heavily on the Day of Judgment. And Ramadan is a time where we struggle with good character, particularly if we're depleted beforehand and we've been doing too much. It's important that we're able to shine in our following the Prophet ﷺ. Point number 2 is about intention. So actions are by intention, and we can make lots of good intentions. And, you know, it's not about the size of the action, it's about the quality and the sincerity of the action. So, you know, when we're serving our families, or we're calling our parents to see how they're doing, or we're smiling at our neighbors, or, you know, we're helping our children with their homework, all of those things are rewardable actions if they're done for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But even better still, you know, if you do decide to cut back and you decide to go for that walk becomes an ibadah. If you then decide to practice some self-care, which is point number 3, which would help us to return to our equilibrium, that too becomes an ibadah, because we're doing that to look after the bodies that we've abused for so long. And on this note, I just wanted to mention the habit of napping. So often we think that, you know, sleep is a waste of time, or, you know, more so now that's changed. But in Ramadan, many of us struggle to get our sleep. So the sleep that we need ideally is 3 cycles of 90 minutes between Isha and Suhoor. And then, you know, 1 or 2 cycles after that, if you're able to. And then in the daytime, the Prophet ﷺ would take a nap called a Qaylula. And that would typically be between Dhuhr and Asr. And we know from a scientific point of view, it should be between 10 and 30 minutes, or, you know, longer than, you know, or sorry, up to 90 minutes, but not between 30 and 90. So that means that you don't wake up completely exhausted, but it allows you to reboot. And if you make that nap, take that nap with the intention of looking after your body and the intention of getting up to do the night prayers, Taraweeh, the Hajjud, Witr, etc., then all of that becomes a worship, particularly if you lie down in the state of wudu. So, you know, these are simple things that we can implement, and simple ways that we can incorporate rest into our routines. Point number 3 is about self-care. And in that, in terms of returning to our equilibrium, we have to look after our bodies as well. So that might be putting in a gentle exercise routine, whether that's a walk at Taraweeh time, whether it's getting some daylight, sunshine, particularly a morning walk is very, very good for regulating our body clocks and our hormones and our mood. You know, also eating nutritious foods, that's halal and tayyib. Not eating in excess, avoiding processed and junk foods, avoiding gluttony, and eating with consideration for other people. And also cooking with consideration, so not cooking excess food that goes to waste, and not spoiling our families with too much food at iftar time or suhoor time. For that reason, it's not the month of cooking, it's a month of spiritual connection and slowing down, not really feeding those desires. Point number 4 is about setting clear goals. So the question I would say, what am I looking to take away this Ramadan? So if each Ramadan was a building block till we died, what blocks would I want to lay down? What would I like to really achieve? And setting some SMART goals. So those goals don't have to be many, and they don't have to be complicated, but they allow us to structure our time. So it might be, for example, that you do want to make a khatma of the Quran and you're going to read a few pages after every prayer, or that you want to memorize a particular surah and you're going to learn a certain number of lines every day, or you're going to consolidate the tajweed in one chapter or study the tafsir of a particular chapter. The difficulty we have now is with this, subhanAllah, this whole deluge of information that comes in through social media and internet channels, so many amazing teachers and talks. It's very easy just to spend all your time doing that and not know where you're going. And perhaps Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will guide you to something really special there. But I think what I've really realized is that sometimes it can be quite overwhelming receiving a lot of material. And the way I've decided to filter it myself this year is to really decide what I'm going to be doing and what I'd like to do longer term. and make sure, inshallah, I can build on that. So those simple goals might, yeah, I think I've talked about the simple goals, and making, putting quality over quantity. Of course, I'm now talking about the first 20 days of Ramadan. The last 10 days, it's quality and quantity. So those days are when the Prophet says someone would tighten his waistcloth and he would exert himself in worship. But up until that, this is all about restructuring and improving ourselves, and finding that balance to take away after the month is over as well. And and really creating a long-term reset. So I hope, inshallah, this talk's been beneficial, and I hope that, like myself, I've given you some food for thought to think about how you'd like to live your life differently, what you'd like your life to look like, and how you see yourself traveling back to your Lord. Okay, Jazakumullah khairan. Assalamu alaikum.